Hello, students. So, today we're going to dive into a really important chapter in world history, the fall of the Russian Empire. We'll be looking very closely at how the First World War wasn't just some background event, but actually a critical moment that led straight to the Russian Revolution. So, let's begin.
Okay, so to really understand this whole story properly, we're going to look at it in 5 clear steps. First up, a war for national pride. Then we'll move on to defeat and demoralization. After that, we'll see how the economy was put under strain. Then we'll discuss why the autocracy made unpopular. And finally, we will understand the war as a catalyst for the revolution.
All right, so let's start with our first point, a war for national pride. Let's picture the scene. The year is 1914, and Russia has just entered the First World War. Now, the leader of Russia at this time was Tsar Nicholas II, and remember, he was an autocrat, which means he had total, absolute power over the whole country. And at first, his decision to join the war was actually very popular. It brought about a real sense of national unity.
You see, right at the start of the war, people in Russia were actually very supportive. There was this huge wave of patriotism, a strong feeling of love for their country. People from all different backgrounds, they all came together to support their leader, Tsar Nicholas II. They really believed this war would bring glory to Russia.
And just to show you how strong this nationalistic feeling was, they actually changed the name of the capital city. Think about that. The city was called St. Petersburg, but that name sounded a bit too German. And since Germany was the enemy, they changed it to Petrograd to make it sound more Russian. This small change tells you a lot about the strong anti-German feelings at the time.
Okay, so we move to our second point, defeat and demoralization. Because, well, that early wave of patriotism didn't last very long. The excitement quickly disappeared as the country came face to face with the harsh realities of the war on the Eastern Front. So let's take a look at what was actually happening on the battlefield.
Now, on the Eastern Front, Russia was fighting against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And the war here was very different from the war in the West. In the West, they had trench warfare, where armies didn't move much. But here, the armies moved a lot, leading to massive battles and, unfortunately, very large numbers of casualties. The defeats between 1914 and 1916 were shocking, and they were completely demoralizing for everyone.
Let's just pause on this number for a second. Over 7 million. By 1917, this was the number of Russian casualties. And casualties means soldiers who were killed, who were injured, or who were taken prisoner. It's a truly staggering number, a massive, massive loss of human life. And please remember, this number is not just a statistic. Every single one of those 7 million was a real person, just like the soldiers you see in this picture. They were someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. They were part of the famous Russian steamroller, the largest army in the world. The Tsar's power completely depended on the loyalty of these soldiers, but after so much loss, that loyalty was beginning to break.
And then, things got even worse. As the Russian army retreated, they destroyed crops and buildings on their own land. The idea was to leave nothing for the enemy. But what this actually did was create over 3 million refugees inside Russia. Can you imagine your own army destroying your home? This action turned so many people against the government and against the Tsar.
Okay, so now for our third point, an economy under strain. The problems weren't just on the battlefield. Back at home, a different kind of disaster was unfolding. The war was putting huge pressure on Russia's economy, and it was starting to break. So, let's look at how this happened, step by step. First, Germany's navy controlled the Baltic Sea, which meant that industrial supplies from other countries were cut off. In Russia itself, industrial equipment started to break down very fast. Then, the railway lines, the main way to transport goods, they also began to break down. On top of that, all the able-bodied men were sent to fight in the war, which created a big labor shortage. And what happens then? Well, small workshops that produced essential goods started to shut down one by one.
And on top of all these industrial problems, there was an even bigger issue: food. You see, large amounts of grain were being sent to feed the army. That's understandable, right? But it meant there wasn't enough food left for the people in the cities. This led to severe shortages of bread and flour. For the people in the cities, this meant going hungry.
This quote here really paints a picture of how bad things got. By the winter of 1916, riots at bread shops were common. People weren't just hungry anymore, they were desperate, and they were getting angry. Just imagine standing in a queue for bread in the freezing cold, only to find there is none left. That desperation turned into anger, and these bread riots became a common sight in the cities.
So this brings us to a really important question. I want you to just think about this for a moment. What happens when people are starving, and the government, which is supposed to help them, seems to be doing nothing? Well, the answer is people lose trust. They lose faith in their leaders. And this is exactly what started to happen in Russia.
Right, so this leads us perfectly to our next section, the autocracy made unpopular. All this suffering, the military defeats, the food shortages, it all led people to blame the one person in charge of everything, the Tsar. What we see here is a complete crisis of leadership and a collapse of trust in his government.
Now, even as the war was going so badly, the Tsar made a big mistake. He refused to consult the main parties in the Duma, which was Russia's parliament. Remember, as an autocrat, he believed he didn't need to listen to anyone. By doing this, he made more and more important people turn against him. His support was becoming very, very thin.
And there were other factors that made the Tsar and his family very unpopular. His wife, the Tsarina Alexandra, was originally from Germany, and this made people suspicious of her during the war. Then there was her advisor, a monk named Rasputin, who many people disliked and distrusted. All these things combined really damaged the public image and credibility of the royal family.
So, this brings us to our fifth and final point, the war as a catalyst. Now, this is a very important idea to understand. It's easy to think that the war was the only cause of the revolution, but that's not exactly true. The war didn't create all the problems, but it pushed Russia towards revolution much faster. The key word to understand here is catalyst. What is a catalyst? Well, it's something that doesn't start a process, but it makes that process happen much, much faster. Think about it. Russia already had many problems before the war started: poverty, inequality, a government people didn't like. The war took all these existing problems and just intensified them. It made everything worse and accelerated the whole crisis. So, let's quickly recap the whole process. You can think of it as a downward spiral. First, you have the military defeats, which destroyed morale. This leads to the second step, economic collapse, where industries failed and people in the cities were starving. The third step, a complete loss of public trust in the Tsar and his leadership. And when you put all of that together, you get the final step, a revolutionary crisis. The entire system was now just too weak to survive.
And so, we end with this final thought. By early 1917, the situation was absolutely critical. You have a demoralized army that no longer wants to fight for the Tsar. You have starving people rioting for bread in the streets. And you have a Tsar who has lost all trust and credibility. With all the pillars of his power collapsing, how long could the monarchy possibly survive? The question was no longer if it would fall, but when. And this sets the stage perfectly for the next chapter in our story, the February Revolution.